Those of you who don't know me, I'm Cathy Willis. I'm the principal here, and I'm a biologist myself and do a lot of work in this environmental sphere. And the conversations in environmental sustainability beyond greenwashing was we set this up about 2 years ago as we do 2 seminars a year, very much as a panel debate to really ask the questions that people don't normally ask. And this is why we've asked all 4 speakers today to address the same question, but from their perspective. And also to try and bring together science, social sciences, humanities, and even medical sciences into the same room. So we're not all having separate conversations, which far too often happens across Oxford. So I'm absolutely delighted. I do this with colleagues in college. It's not only my own show, and today the whole event is going to be run by my colleague Professor Wes Williams. Wes is a professor of French literature, but he also used to be the director of Torch, which ran all the sort of cross-cultural events in the humanities division. I hope I've described it correctly, Wes, then, rather than completely butchered what you did. Anyway, so I'm going to hand over to Wes, who will now run this whole panel debate and chair the questions at the end. And then please do stay on at the end. We can move out onto the terrace, and there are cold drinks, I promise, so we can continue the conversations there. So Wes, over to you.
Thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Cathy. Yeah, this is the 5th in the series of these events, and it's the first where we've tried, as you say, to set a particular question to a wide range of scholars around the question of water, and more specifically around deltas. And I thought I'd start, because I've been involved in cultural events and because I'm a literary scholar, with a poem. I'm going to start with a poem by Adrienne Rich, which was written in Fresno, which is quite a long way away from most deltas, but it's called Delta. If you have taken this rubble for my past, raking through it for fragments you could sell, know that long ago I moved on, deeper into the heart of the matter. If you think you can grasp me, think again. My story flows in more than one direction, a delta springing from the riverbed with its 5 fingers spread. That, as I say, is by Adrienne Rich from a collection called Time's Power. Now, I chose it not just because it's about deltas, but because it's also about time's power. And one of the things that all of our speakers will be talking about today in various different ways is the times that we live in, and the times that we have lived in as a species, and the times ahead of us in the future, and how those 3, if you like, different modes of time, and the power of those times might reasonably, sensibly, but also imaginatively connect. And lastly, the 5 fingers in my poem, or Adrienne Rich's poem, are the 4 speakers and you, the audience. There is a 5th finger here, and that's you. So you will have questions, I hope, to bring to the debate after each of our speakers have spoken. I'm just going to spend a little minute introducing people. I'm going to introduce all 4 speakers now, rather than individually between each one. First up, we'll have Jim Hall, Professor Jim Hall, Professor of Climate and Environmental Risks at the Environmental Change Institute here in Oxford. Jim is internationally recognized for his research on risk analysis and decision-making under uncertainty for water resource systems, flood and coastal risk management, infrastructure systems, and adaptation to climate change. The word risk, as you'll have heard, comes up many times in Jim's work, and of course, it's a key question that we're all facing. His group developed the first national water resource system simulation model for England and Wales, which to me means he's also in the business of representation and imagination and making things that aren't quite real in order to help us think about the real world. And lastly, his systems analysis models have been applied worldwide, and his methods have been applied worldwide as well. We also have Professor Veronica Strang from the School of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography here in Oxford. Veronica is a cultural anthropologist. Her ethnographic research and consultancy work is concerned with human-environmental relationships, in particular, society's engagements with water. She has worked with multiple organizations, including UNESCO, the UN, on water sustainability issues, as well as assisting indigenous communities' claims for land and water. Her most recent book, Water Beings, for which you can find flyers outside, Water Beings from Nature Worship to the Environmental Crisis, was published by Reaction in 2023. Already then you can see that we're moving across disciplines, and maybe when you hear a slight twang in Veronica's accents, you'll know we're moving across the world as well, although your work is also globally interested, as is yours. Next is Professor Catherine Ibbott from the Faculty of Medieval and Modern Languages, also here at Oxford. Catherine's latest work, provisionally entitled Liquid Empire, follows literary rivers across texts from France and the Americas, thinking about those rivers as tributaries to a wider oceanic history. In exploring rivers from the Rhine to the Mississippi, she asks, how does the small scale of the riverbank writing paradoxically allow us to trace expansionist poetics and politics of France in particular, but also more widely, and argues that following the river allows us to build a different literary and cultural history of early modern France, but again, of also the globe. And then our last speaker is Professor Dilip da Cunha, I'm so sorry. Dilip has authored many books, including the award-winning The Invention of Rivers, Alexander's Eye, and Ganga's Descent. When I knew that we were going to take on deltas as a theme, I had in my dream that Dilip might come. I'm so glad to see you here. Dilip comes from the States, based in Philadelphia, and we're very, very pleased to have you here. The Invention of Rivers stems from questioning the natural status given to rivers and the imaging and imagining that the assumption that rivers are somehow natural has inspired. For far from being natural entities, Dilip considers rivers to be products of a cultivated eye that privilege water at one moment in the hydrological cycle, when it appears, water, to be containable and controllable. His work argues for an alternative ground for design and planning. That then, as they say on the radio, is our panel, and I'd like us to begin by thanking them all for being here. I'll now get out of the way and hand over to Jim, who'll take over for the first 15 minutes or so. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here to such a fascinating topic, and a topic which is close to my heart, and I agree we don't talk about enough, so I'm glad that we've got a room full of people to talk about it this evening. I've invoked the word the Anthropocene in the title, and I'll kind of somehow introduce our understanding of that as I go through my talk. But before I move on, I've also put Robert Nichols' name on this page. When I've collaborated with Robert, University of East Anglia, for many years on deltas, and when it dawned upon me not so long ago, I was reminded that I had to do this talk. I got in touch with Robert and said, help. And so some of this comes with Robert's help, and some of it comes from the work of my students and research group. So full acknowledgements there. If I can, we're asked to pose questions this afternoon. What is a delta is one question, and I think we're going to get some different answers to that question as we go through the evening. The answer I'm going to give you is the version which you would get in GCSE geography, I'm afraid. It's not a bad place to start, which is that deltas are created because of the transport of sediment by rivers hitting flat parts of the landscape at the edge of the sea, and that sediment being deposited and creating a geomorphological feature, which, as we can see on the Nile here, has a shape somehow approximating to a Greek letter delta. Let me just expand upon that a little bit more. Here we're looking from space at the Ganges-Brahmaputra Meghna plain. The Himalayas are in the top of the picture, so the tectonic event of creating those mountains, exposing them to really very rapid erosion, created vast quantities of sediment, which was carried by meltwater and monsoon runoff down through those massive river systems, where they flattened out as they approached the Bay of Bengal and lead to enormous amounts of sediment deposition. And the shape of that delta continues to be dynamic, in the sense that there are dynamics with respect to the amount of sediment being transported down. Tectonics still play a part in that, in the sense that when earthquakes occur, particularly large amounts of sediment go into the river and get carried down through the system. Tectonics also lead to subsidence, but these are fine and in many senses organic material heavy sediment, so they naturally subside. In any case, they settle. And in the meantime, there's the action from the sea of waves, storm surges, cyclones, which are eroding away the sediments on the marine side. So one has a dynamic system, a system sedimentary and biophysical, which is influenced by this interplay between different hydrological and marine processes. And then on top of that, we begin to superimpose all of these enormous human interventions which are taking place on that system. So if you look at the top, the construction of dams and barrages across the system traps that amount of sediment which was to be flowing down and continuously feeding the delta. Then within the delta itself, there's been a process here, I've used the somewhat ugly word of polarization going on. So this is, of course, borrowed from the Dutch context of building ring dikes in order to create semi-permanently dry areas which are more suitable for agriculture. And that has been a major interruption in the delta dynamics, and I'll come to that a little bit more. So agriculture, and then more recently a proliferation of aquaculture, shrimp farming, which has led to modification of that infrastructure, and also has been a big interference on the delta. And then on the right-hand side coming here is the various impacts of climate change, changing the amount of precipitation through changes in the monsoon, glacial melting, which is changing the amount of meltwater coming from the Himalayas, sea level rise, changing patterns of cyclones, which are all modifying that system as well. So let me put that climate change piece in perspective. And this is a really important slide, and I know that you're sat quite a long way from it. I will do my best to explain it, including especially for the people at the back, because this is a very, very interesting story, at least I think it is. Let's start with the middle picture here. All of these pictures are looking at global mean sea level on different timescales. So here, last 150 years, here, last 24,000 years, here, last 35 million years. And we'll start with the piece in the middle, and this is today's sea level here, and this is sea level at the coldest point of the last ice age, the so-called last glacial maximum, 20-odd thousand years ago. And sea level then was about 120 meters below global mean sea level now. And so you can see as we come out of the last glacial maximum, we have this, I mean, we're looking at thousands of years here, but this is a steep line on a graph of increasing sea levels up until about 8,000 years ago. And then after that, the rise in global mean sea level has really been relatively small, about 4 or 5 meters over the last 8,000 years. And all of the world's major deltas have come into existence in that time frame. Because if one was in this time frame here, the rate of sea level rise would submerge that accumulation of sediments. And as sea level rise has slowed down, you can understand that the sediments have been able to build out this big landform. If we just look briefly at the last 130 years, global mean sea levels have continued to go up at about the same rate as they were over the last 8,000 years. And just a bit of it, and you have to squint at this, and apologies again to the people at the back of the room, to see a little bit of an uptick in global mean sea levels over the last few decades. Obviously, if one looks at a graph of global mean temperatures, you get a hockey stick over the last, well, since the middle of the last century. But sea level responds very slowly to those global mean temperature increases. It takes a long time for the oceans to absorb that heat. It takes a long time for glaciers and ice sheets to melt and contribute to mean sea level. And then just looking briefly back over these much longer time frames. So these are, this is 500,000 years before the present day, and you can see sea levels continuing to oscillate in and out of reflecting ice ages with a range of about 120 meters. And that goes on through the Pleistocene, and then as we go back into deeper geological history, we can see at times when global mean temperatures were obviously higher, and we had global mean sea levels up to about 50 meters above what they are at the moment. So clearly a world in which there was much less in the terms of ice sheets than exist at the moment in Greenland and Antarctica. Then looking ahead, I referred to this very kind of barely noticeable uptick in global mean sea levels up to the present day. Then depending on how much we emit, and also depending on how sensitive ice sheets actually prove to be with respect to increasing global mean temperatures, we get a range of different sea level projections at the end of the century. With this much more alarming low likelihood, high impact storyline. This was the first time that a scenario like that had been included in the IPCC's assessment, which tried to incorporate some of these uncertainties in ice sheet dynamics. And then the other thing, for the first time, which the IPCC did in its sixth assessment, was look ahead to 2300, recognizing what I've just said about the inertia in the oceans and in the ice sheets, that actually we are able to predict within an uncertainty range what will be happening 2.5 centuries from now, because of the slow rate in which those systems respond to global mean temperatures. And at a lower emission scenario, one's looking at between 1 meter and 3 meters. A high emission scenario, one could be in the realm of 7 meters of sea level rise on that type of time scale. And a chunk of that is already very well locked in. So just a snapshot of where these systems are around the world. And the numbers on this diagram are the millions of people who are living in delta systems. So which of these systems are most exposed to those impacts of climate change? And so if we, there's around 500 million people, 7% of the world's population living in deltas on about 1% of the world's land area. Let me just zoom in a little bit on the Ganges-Brahmaputra Meghna basin, which I showed you from space, because this has been a particular interest of ours. And this diagram here, and we're going to hear more about history in a moment, this diagram here gives us a kind of long history of that delta, going again back into deep geological time, but then going through the last 200 years, looking at some of these major geomorphological events, large channel migrations, the 1950 Assam earthquake, and then as we go closer to the present day, these beginning to these major human interventions in the system, large-scale polarization, that word again in the 1960s and 70s, completion of the Farakar barrage, so a barrage, one of the barrages which has trapped sediment, and now leading to this really quite major changes within the system. A lot of siltation of the tidal channels, dry season salinization, so saline water and groundwater coming in and making agriculture much more challenging. Relatively recently, this large-scale uptake of shrimp farming, which again has introduced lots more saline water into the delta. And so where we get to, and some people like these types of diagrams, some people don't, but what we're trying to kind of emphasize here is that to understand this system now, we need to really understand the interdependencies between this dynamic geomorphological system and all of the human behaviors and adaptations that are taking place in them, the changes in population, in land use, in livelihoods, in poverty and health. Which I suppose takes me back to to revisit this word, the Anthropocene, because it really kind of stands out now. If we look at a landform like this, how what we see now, what we see on this side of the picture with polders, flood protection, subsidence because of groundwater abstraction, meaning that the ground is subsiding more, blocking of sediment with dams, transportation, including waterway transportation, which involves dredging, has been a profound influence. And in fact, this landform now is entirely human influence as compared to the sediment dynamics which I started with. So just to conclude, let me share some thoughts about the future of those deltas, maybe with the Ganges, Brahmaputra, Meghna Delta in mind. I mean, it's not surprising to say that if we look ahead, say, for 30 years, so not on those timescales in which we might get meters of sea level rise, next 30 years, what happens in a delta system like that depends on the adaptations, on the choices, on the engineering interventions which go on within that system. That's not to say that the weather and climate change doesn't matter. In particular, there could and there probably will be some very major climate-related shocks. So storm surges, cyclones passing across this system themselves not only cause an immediate and large amount of human impact, but they also change the shape and the configuration of the delta. As we look further into the future, maybe to 2100 and beyond, there are really kind of three options for deltas. Retreat, and in a sense, I mean, these are landforms which have always responded to sea level rise, and so one version, and in less populated parts of the world, this is the likely version, that the landforms will be left to do their thing, and they're naturally resilient systems, and they will adapt their role inland and become submerged. The second and kind of conventional engineering option, this is classic Rhine Delta, Netherlands. It's what the polarization project within the GMB led to, is protection of the population with ever higher dikes, and that can just go on and on. There are parts of the Netherlands which are 9 meters below mean sea level, continuing to subside, ever higher pumping requirements, and a residual risk, so this low probability but still existent scenario in which a higher surge comes along and then tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people would be exposed to flooding. Or there's the possibility of building elevation, and so of allowing in a managed way more seasonal flooding of the land, which would deposit some more sediment and allow at least some element of catch-up of land elevation. There is a question as to whether there's now enough sediment available, because so much of the sediment supply upstream has been blocked, and there's a big question around social acceptability. These are densely populated places. Building elevation means agreeing with people to move out of their farmland to allow it to be flooded, to allow those sediments to build up. And then for many people, the traditional solution, engineering solution, superficially looks, frankly, much more attractive in the way that has happened in the Netherlands, but also achieving that is costly. It requires high wealth, it requires access to technology, it requires good governance. So to conclude, just a few thoughts. First, what I've tried to put across is that these dramatic landforms now are clearly a consequence of human interaction as well as Earth surface processes, and in order to understand them, we need to understand the dynamics of those interactions. There are several different versions of what will become of deltas like this in the future. There is a version, for example, by building elevation and by strategic retreat in some places, of a version of deltas that are reasonably prosperous into the future. But it requires managed intervention, managed adaptation. There are also versions which are much more, well, effectively that a collapse involving degraded livelihoods, shocks from extreme events, increasing poverty may materialize as well. And so there are multiple versions of the future for these systems, and what happens depends on what we choose. Thank you.
What happens depends on what we choose. I think we might come back to that statement. Next is Veronica. We've already been taken into deep history and into the future. Veronica will now take us further still. Thank you.
I think the last time I was at Teddy Hall was about 35 years ago as a partying PhD student. So I'm hoping to be slightly more sober on this occasion. Now, a lot of my research focuses on deltas because my answer to what is a delta is that they are the sum total of relationships between people and rivers and their ecosystems. And as Jim has made very clear, they're suffering from major causal factors, in particular energy use, urbanization, and unsustainable technological management of land and water. And these causalities persist for two key reasons that I'd like to highlight. One is an underlying and long-standing belief in human exceptionalism and notions of dominion that cast nature as a separate and subservient domain to be acted upon and engineered to meet the interests of primarily human society. Two is an economic ideology focused on constant growth and development, which, as well as lending itself to centuries of hegemonic appropriation of other people's homelands, is ruthlessly exploitative of the non-human world. And the mantra that growth is essential to societal well-being has so normalized that it sometimes obscures a very long human history in which societies were not inevitably expansive, but sometimes maintained circular and quite sustainable economies for many millennia. What unrestrained growth means for rivers and deltas, of course, is constant coercive engineering, dams, channels, diversions that control land and water. And until recently, this has been sort of taken as being something to be valorized as a technological accomplishment, state building, control. So in Australia, for example, the creation of vast irrigation schemes has been seen historically as a way of taking control over a recalcitrant environment and a zealous manifestation of biblical ideas about greening the desert and creating new water-abundant utopias. And of course, the UK has an even longer history, a much longer history of intensely wetland drainage to enable agricultural and industrial production, with commensurate devaluing and indeed denigration of wetlands as miasmic swamps. And in deltas particularly, of course, we've seen a lot of urbanization and the containment of water flows, and that's actually been linked conceptually with civilization. And as well as adding to climate change at a global level, this focus on coercive control has led to rivers dying of pollution, stripped of water storing habitats and biodiversity, and increasingly prone to floods and droughts. And these problems, of course, have major impacts on the human communities, in particular the place-based societies often clustered around deltas, who, of course, depend on healthy ecosystems to maintain traditional lifeways. So failing to sustain these environments results in a critical loss not only of biological but also cultural diversity. And the point that I want to drive home is that these problems are characterized by massive inequalities in power relations between dominant human groups and less powerful communities, but also between humans and other species. And in this equation, the needs and interests of the less powerful are invariably overridden and critically not effectively represented in our decision-making processes. So our hosts have asked me to discuss how to preserve local cultures and promote sustainable practices. Now, we don't have time to go into any ethnographic depth, but I'll give you a couple of tiny thumbnail sketches that I hope will illustrate some key factors. I've worked for many groups with indigenous communities living in the Mitchell River Delta area who, despite a very difficult colonial history, have sought to protect their cultural traditions and their homelands and what is for them a sentient cultural land and waterscape that is inhabited by ancestral beings who are a sort of sentient presence and who take care of their human and non-human descendants. And they conduct rituals at sacred sites. They continue to fish and hunt in the Delta area. They make fish traps, sand ovens, and so forth. And they're fortunate in having managed to regain control of ownership rights over some of their traditional country, as they call it. But of course, their efforts and the Delta itself are subject to predictable pressures, and these include mining, gold mining, and therefore cyanide pollution upriver, feral plant and animal species, the impacts of intensive cattle production, the growth of tourism in Cape York, and of course commercial fishing and all the usual social and economic pressures that are experienced by remote indigenous communities in Australia. Nevertheless, although their lifeways have been radically transformed, their location in a relatively remote area and their successful legal claims to regain some of their land and a degree of self-determination has made it possible for the community to uphold many important beliefs and values and practices that ensure the long-term sustainability of their society and its ecosystems. And I've also worked intensively in the Brisbane River Delta area where the pressures on Indigenous communities are far greater. They've lost almost all control over their homelands. They've been displaced by a much larger and ever-increasing non-Indigenous population, and that's brought with it fishing, forest, agriculture, industry, and so forth, and various commercial, recreational things, and again, tourism, and a major port, and of course, a massive urban conurbation. And to support all these activities, the river has been dammed, diverted, and canalised, and all of which has had devastating effects on the delta environment and related marine areas. Nevertheless, on Stradbroke Island, the Quandamooka community persists in trying to look after their sacred sites and trying to maintain some traditional fishing and resource use, but in reality, their capacities to do so have been effectively subsumed by a tidal wave of colonial settlement and its multiple impositions. So what these two examples, I hope, illustrate is that maintaining place-based cultural lifeways really depends on the extent to which communities can gain or regain legal title, rights, and control over their land and water, and the extent to which their homelands remain intact in terms of their ecological health and diversity. Because Indigenous lifeways are holistic, they depend on a multiplicity of societal and material conditions, and the only way in which they can be truly sustained is if most of those conditions are present. So trying to bolt on solutions, like saying, oh, well, you can have special rights to resource use and so forth, without addressing the more complex issues, is unlikely to be very effective. And in a sense, this is also true of all the other groups that depend on healthy aquatic ecosystems to sustain themselves. And piecemeal solutions, such as ever higher flood defences, minor changes in lifestyle that do little to slow expanding levels of consumption, or tackle inexorably rising sea levels, or seriously address the whole-scale ecological damage that has led to the current environmental crisis, are clearly not going to work really for anyone. So I would like to turn to one of the many reasons why this cultural diversity that I've described is as critical as biodiversity, and focus on alternative ways of thinking about water, rivers, and deltas that indigenous communities and the anthropologists who have the privilege of working with them have brought into debates. So for decades now, inspired by alternative worldviews, scholars and environmental activists have been calling for a paradigmatic shift in thinking that challenges dualistic visions of nature and culture and recognizes that humans are not outside acting on nature, but are actually part of an indivisible, dynamically relational world that is actively co-created by all living kinds. And in a sense, this links with Jim's talk, that in fact we see deltas being affected and co-created by natural processes and by human action. So although our language is very different, you can see a link there. Now, worldviews that actually acknowledge the collaborative agency of the non-human species and ecosystems generate very different kinds of environmental relationships. So, like those in the Aboriginal communities I work with, these relationships with the non-human are more egalitarian, they're more based on notions of partnership and reciprocity. And that all sounds very cozy and convivial, but let's be very clear that any meaningful shift in that direction requires a radical revision of the existing status quo. It challenges interhuman and interspecies inequalities and a very differential access to democratic representation and material resources, such as sufficiently clean water. And that's why these same debates have raised questions about human and non-human rights, promoting the rights of disadvantaged human communities, as well as exploring the potential for deltas, rivers, forests, mountains, and whole ecosystems to be given legal personhood and concomitant rights, not to have their needs and interests overridden by destructive human practices. And the issue of personhood for non-human beings and ecosystems has been very interesting. It's been useful underlining their co-creative agency in composing the world, but it's also posed some very challenging questions. How do you translate that into actions that actually ensure that non-human needs and interests are met to the extent that all species can flourish sustainably? And that's why I have made the notion of equality and diversity central to this discussion, because a shift towards more convivial lifeways means ensuring that our democratic processes are actually inclusive of all actors. And anthropologists often act as advocates for indigenous communities, and in theory, though sadly less often in practice, most now have some democratic representation. But because this is much less discussed, and because I would argue we can't achieve sustainable lifeways without it, we must also ask, how do we ensure that the needs and interests of non-human beings and ecosystems are represented in our democratic decision-making? And in formulating some ideas about how this might work in river catchment areas and, of course, deltas, I've drawn on an anthropological classic that some of you may know by Benedict Anderson. It's called Imagined Communities. And he looks at how we imagine all the communities that we belong to, our professional, our social, our kin communities, our neighbourhoods, etc. And in a thought experiment entitled Reimagined Communities, I've suggested that we need to widen our concept of community to encompass the non-human populations with whom we share catchment areas, and we should acknowledge their role as actors in our shared existence, and we should include them and represent their needs and interests in our decision-making. Now, clearly, river ecosystems, their non-human inhabitants can't speak for themselves, but that's not an insurmountable problem. We have already got illegal and ethical precedents for representing the needs of humans who can't speak for themselves, such as small children. And most countries have an abundance, we have some in this room, of scientific experts, the hydrologists, the biologists, the ecologists, social scientists, people like who in the Environmental Change Institute here. There are also multiple forms of local and indigenous knowledge about what ecosystems and non-human species need to flourish. So this This exercise doesn't have to be impossibly comprehensive. In reality, if we simply met the needs and interests of a sensible cross-section of species in any river catchment and delta, we would greatly improve the odds of ensuring the health of the whole ecosystem. But the much greater challenge is to find ways to represent these needs in political processes. But again, there's some useful models available. So, for example, one comes from New Zealand, where Maori iwi have succeeded in gaining a declaration that as living ancestors, forests, rivers and mountains are legal persons with rights. And the Whanganui River now has 2 representatives, Tuputua, whose role is to speak for the river and its interests. And in Australia, Indigenous elders are increasingly doing the same kind of advisory role as they do in Canada and other countries with Indigenous population. And of course, there's no one-size-fits-all formula. Each cultural context requires democratic mechanisms that fit its particular social and political arrangements. So in the UK, for example, we could quite readily assemble groups of experts and local people well able to articulate the needs of riverine ecosystems and their non-human communities. The question then is how to make sure that representation is effective. Which brings me back to the point that I made at the outset, that deltas are the sum of multiple non-human and human relationships throughout whole catchment areas. A similar point can be made about democratic representation. At the moment, our decision-making is siloed into agriculture, transport, housing, energy, departments that are largely disconnected from each other, and then a rather feeble, underfunded environment agency. So we really need to seek representational practices that are joined up, that flow across these whole areas. We could start perhaps, for example, by ensuring that each government department filters decisions through an appropriate group of expert representatives so that they can actually consider the implications of the decisions being made and the ecological impacts. And then that would bring those needs and interests as a presence into every decision-making process. And hopefully, this may be optimistic, but I remain optimistic, just by making those things, articulating them in decision processes, we would hope to discourage the casual externalization of costs, either to non-human beings or less powerful human groups, and therefore push decisions in more sustainable directions. But to be successful, such practices actually have to think about different values: equality, diversity. We have to include diverse cultural perspectives and the needs of all living kinds more fully. And that means that we have to introduce much stronger notions of equality into decision-making. And one of the outcomes of thinking more inclusively about a co-created world is that separate notions of biodiversity and cultural diversity are no longer useful as separate concepts. So I'll conclude with a question about what's achievable. Now, of course, being practical, in very densely populated societies, even with the most effective representation of non-human interests, you can't make radical transformations to land and water use throughout entire catchment areas. But we can improve matters significantly with better policies. For example, preventing habitat destruction, pollution, over-abstraction, and locating housing and infrastructure more appropriately. And that's clearly what's needed in the longer term. And there's more immediate scope, perhaps, for restoring healthy ecological corridors along all of our rivers, so that the riparian land contains multiple water storage areas, wetlands, forests, that not only moderate water flows to the advantage of all the communities living on the floodplains, but provide the range of habitats that are needed to support diverse species, as well as a range of traditional cultural practices. And there are some success stories already. On the River Stour in Dorset, where I've worked for many years, there's been some very good collaboration between local conservationists, farmers, local government agency, and they've managed to create an ecological corridor running from the source to the sea. So it can be done, and we don't talk about that enough. And critically, these kinds of improvements would assist many of the cultural groups seeking to maintain traditional lifeways. There's a lot to be gained by combining ecological corridors and restoring those with the valorization of cultural heritage. And a colleague and I recently suggested an approach we've described, this one's for Wes, as eco-pilgrimages. And these give access to riparian corridors, but also at the same time linking up sacred sites, etc., and along the way. So there are many holy wells clustered along the Stour Valley, which sit within that ecological corridor. And in a sense, you're sort of combining things that become more than the sum of their parts, because you're creating a space in which people actually engage with both the ecological diversity and the cultural diversity within river catchments. And in the Mitchell River, habitat restoration supporting traditional practices could similarly highlight sacred sites, songlines, and story places. So I'll conclude. I hope that I have convinced you that an imaginative shift in conceptual positionality, a way of thinking that places humankind within rather than in destructive opposition to the rest of the living world, which valorizes equality and diversity, can actually open up a lot of imaginative opportunities to develop more sustainable policies and practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Veronica took Jim's question about depends on how we decide and expanded the question of who we exactly are and who gets to decide, and brought in the key question of representation. Not only representation of how we see the world and our place in relation to it, but also who speaks for, who in what situations and in what contexts do the non-human, the more than human, the humanimal, there are many words for it, the worlds beyond ourselves, the parts of the world beyond ourselves, find a voice, find representation. Talking about words for it, we're now going to shift. Catherine's not going to speak in French, but is going to have French writing as somewhere at the centre of her talk. Yeah, we hope so. Over to Catherine. I hope also, just to say, Veronica raised a lot of questions, as did Jim, as will you. I hope you're, in the meantime, gathering up questions ready for the conversation later. Over to Catherine.
Thank you. And thank you to Jim and Veronica for giving me ideas that made me scribble as you talked. I feel like I'm the ghost of Delta past. So I'm going to begin with a plaintive question from the manuscript journal of one Jean-Baptiste Minet, engineer and cartographer, on 1682's troubled French expedition to chart the Mississippi. So coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, and I'm going to be saying that term a number of times, I hope it doesn't bother people, to chart the Mississippi. So the French had come some way down the Mississippi. This time they're coming the other way to try and find a warm water port. So this is an expedition conducted by René Robert de La Salle. Wasn't it true, Minet wrote in a series of questions aiming to indict the expedition leader some years later, that La Salle had promised his companions a river? Didn't he promise us a river, he said? Why did he tell us afterwards he hadn't promised it? Didn't you promise us a river? Minet's question haunts all subsequent European settler attempts to promise the Mississippi, many of which were so stuck on the river's promise that they foundered when they came across a delta instead. And the questions here produce a kind of recursive list that moves in meanders, as will the texts of many Europeans writing in La Salle's wake. I work in literary and cultural histories, specializing, as Wes said, in early modern France and the Americas, and I'm writing a book with particular attention to this word, riverain, which comes from the word rive, riverbank. So the riverain is a legal term that emerges in the 17th century. It's coined as the riverbank becomes an object of new legal and political scrutiny for the nation of France. And it means broadly something like resident or dweller. Eventually, it comes to have the meaning of property owner. In the book, I think about a range of river dwellers via this term in small rivers and large, French and American, literary texts and historical archives, to think about how the riverbank tells a story of settlement and displacement, residency and migration, let's say channel migration and human migration, both very locally and at global and imperial scale. So you can imagine, in fact, that the Mississippi Delta, the concept of a delta itself, offers particular challenges even to that notion of a stable riverbank. So one of my rivers is the Mississippi, that's over here, which the French first start to map in the late 17th century, and to settle in the settlement first of La Nouvelle-Orléans, New Orleans, in the very early 18th century. So this map is from an expedition that came out from Montreal over here, comes through the Great Lakes system and down through the Mississippi, and in fact they kind of go up all the way again. And Louis Joliet, who makes this map, has been mapping the Mississippi as he goes along, and his canoe is overturned in the rapids, La Chine Rapids, just outside Montreal, and he loses all his notes and draws this map on arrival with a kind of "the river ate my homework" explanation to the governor. So that's one of my favorite early maps. But you can see here that the river is kind of a straight line, right? They haven't yet seen the delta or thought about it. I want to just contrast this with a map beloved of map geeks. This is Harold Fisk's Mississippi Meander map of 1944, which shows the historical movements of the Mississippi. There are whole beautiful psychedelic sequences of these maps. So between the kind of two versions of the river is where I'm situating my work. It's an honor to be here alongside Dilip, whose book, The Invention of Rivers, is probably my favorite on waterscapes. The line separating water from land exists by choice, he writes. A choice not in where it is seen in a shifting and dynamic terrain, but in the fact that it is seen at all. So European cartographers had a really hard time seeing the river in the Mississippi Delta. For La Salle, who along with the hapless Minet tried to find the river's mouth from the Gulf of Mexico, the delta's shifting terrain made it hard to determine precisely what or where the river could be in what Dilip calls an open field of wetness that rose and fell. And the sediment load makes it particularly difficult from the sea to think about where the river is. There's a huge plume of sediment that comes forth into the Gulf like a bird's beak, one of them wrote. Trying to find the mouth of the river from the Gulf of Mexico, La Salle finally landed west of the river mouth in Texas because the delta looked like no other river he could have imagined. So there's endless shenanigans around this, but eventually this is 1701, the French work out what the delta looks like, and this is the first French map that shows the river's more complicated mouth. So from Texas, La Salle set out 3 times over land to try and hit the Mississippi River itself. Many of his men died on these journeys. The meanders of the Mississippi seem to have confused him, even though he was from Rouen, where the Seine loops and meanders as it makes its way from Paris to the sea. The repeated failure to find the promised river led to chaos. After 2 years, his followers turned on him and killed him. So while the French, by this point, have finally worked out the shapes of the delta, as this map suggests, they couldn't quite work out how to live with it. The river was changing a lot in this period, not just in gradual accretions, but in explosive avulsions in which it abandoned its channel and carved new ones. Not long before the French had come to the region, the river had formed a new channel that's called the Atchafalaya, which runs kind of along here. Just to the left of New Orleans, if you're looking on the map. The early 18th century also saw the creation of a number of oxbow lakes. My favorite is called False River. And with them, the creation of multiple disputes over property. A river is a really complicated thing in property law, a colonial river even more so again, and a delta still more so. So one of the things I'm really interested in is the concept particular to Louisiana law of batcha, so the land that's thrown up by sediment that's still disputed in New Orleans today and that forms a really vital part of its legal history. So what I'm looking at is the years in which the French are working out how to live here and how to live with the river change. Southern Louisiana is produced, as Jim described deltas, by the deposit of alluvial sediment. An 18th century text described with alarm how its contours changed each year. Later, Mark Twain would describe it as the youthfulest batch of country that lies around anywhere. All the land the French saw and wanted to cultivate, writes Lepage du Prat in 1754, was terre rapportée, imported soil, via the vase, the ooze, that the river brings in its annual high waters. And this dumping of soil sometimes necessitated more soil to be brought in the method that Jim was just talking about. At the mouth of the river, where the French built what they called the balise in 1722 as a point to intercept maritime traffic, sediment eventually collected so that the entrée du Mississippi, the entrance to the river, silted up, and more soil was brought in each year at considerable expense to elevate the land. So that's that controlled sedimentation you talked about, and here's a batcher. So this period also sees the start of a new model of river management as the French, and following them the Spanish, and eventually the early United States, sought to build infrastructure that would control the river. The French eventually managed to dry out some of this land, as the historian Christopher Morris puts it, for agriculture, but more generally because, to their way of thinking, a wet place was incapable of sustaining settlement. They build a system of levees, mostly with cypress boards, the wood taken from the cypress swamps, with mass soil behind them, and ditches. And those levees launch a long history of arguments about who's responsible for their maintenance. So this is a 1732 map, sorry, it's a bit vaseux itself, oozy, but here the land is vaseux et inondé, so oozing and flooded. And what is beginning at this point is a long history of trying to dry up that ooze, Jim's polarization, effectively. Today, we see the result of that. The Mississippi River and Tributaries Project manages the levees along the southernmost 1,000 miles of the Mississippi River, a human-made landform second in length only to the Great Wall of China. This is the Lake Borgne surge barrier that protects the city. The Mississippi is today, writes the landscape architect Mathieu Duperex, a cyborg. And this cyborg has made a new kind of landscape, a dried out floodplain. As a result of the separation of the wet and dry, the river carries more sediment and is more prone to large floods. And for a historian, it's hard not to think that this separation tries to stop time itself. In this management, the river is held curiously in stasis. About 200 miles north of New Orleans, there's a marvelously named Old River Control Structure, which keeps the river from doing what it's wanted to do for centuries, which is jump into other channels. So the period I'm looking at allows us to see the alluvial floodplain just as this intervention to dry out the delta begins. So I'm really attached to this map from 1740, which shows the kind of water world that the French are getting to know here, and indicates some of the non-human life that the French found in it also. So I started working on the Mississippi via Minet's journal and the delta of accusatory and often plagiarized accounts of the La Salle expedition. But as I went on, I realized, I said this quite vehemently to Wes and Zainal the other day, I hated these people. And I hated their texts, and I hated the scholarship about them. And I wanted to think instead about the floodplain's other kinds of riverains, or river dwellers. The Chitimacha, the delta's indigenous inhabitants, who are mostly gone by the time the French arrive, but who've left traces the French think about. But chiefly the non-human worlds the French described. You could do this via plant life. Lepage du Prat in 1754 details with some regret what won't grow on this soft and aquatic land. He really missed onions. And what will, this is a watermelon, in its flesh, he says, like a pink snow. And the incorruptible cypress with its beautiful roots here. So its leaf and its birth of the cypress there. The cypress which resisted water but could not resist the lumber greed of Europeans. I tell this story in my chapter via animal life at 3 scales. Bison, who are still found at this point this far south, though that's going to change. Crawfish, still, as this picture suggests, central to southern Louisiana culture. And mosquitoes, also ever present. Aedes aegypti, native to Africa, but who come to the Caribbean and then Louisiana in the early 1700s via the water stored on slave ships, of which more soon. This is a picture of mosquitoes. I don't know if you can make it out, these exquisite, buzzing, frustrating little dots in the air. It's actually from a manuscript, late 16th century manuscript from the Caribbean. And all of these stories, human, vegetal, and animal, are about alluvial soil and the cultures that thrive on them. These forms of life live with what hydrologists today call the flood pulse, a term coined in 1989 by Wolfgang Junk, an in-between landscape, transitional, periodically inundated. But the French are not so good at taking the pulse of this land. One way I want to tell that story is via our mud bag. For the French, the crawfish was a delicious destroyer. Everyone is in agreement on how good they taste, but they also cause trouble. In 1740, Dumont de Montigny described how crawfish pierce the levees in the night. In the morning, you see they've been working on them when you see little water fountains bubbling up. So as fast as the French could build the levees, they had to be mended each morning to stop what I think of as crawfish anti-colonialism. And if the crawfish destroyed French constructions, they also like to build their own. With an instinct particular to them, writes Dumont, they grub in the dirt at night, and in moving it, they build elevations 5 or 6 inches high, like molehills, and they launch from those towers to go and nibble lettuces and other vegetables in our gardens. So at about this same period, Voltaire is saying, we must cultivate our garden, and the crawfish is saying, not so fast. This is, in fact, a crawfish tower, still a pest if you want to have a pristine lawn and live on alluvial soil. But for the Chitimacha, the crawfish had been venerated as a form of creator. It dives to retrieve mud, and in so doing, it builds the world. The Chitimacha, too, were a mound-building culture, like the crawfish, using their mounds as staging areas from which they could hunt in the swamps and wetlands. Later, the French used the soil of their abandoned mounds to build their levees. Dumont describes the early 18th century when crawfish and colonialist are still evenly matched. Some 20 years later, Lepage du Prat notes that when he arrived in Louisiana, the earth had been covered in these towers, but since we made the interior secure with levees, I don't see them anymore. So this tiny mudbug riverain tells, I think, a much larger story. Today, our crawfish is central to southern Louisiana aquaculture, like the shrimp farming that Jim talked about. They're often farmed in the same water as rice. How did the rice get there? The first seed rice came to Louisiana in 1716 from West Africa, from around Senegal, by way of the booming French colony in Saint-Domingue. 2 years later, a boat brought some direct from West Africa, this time along with the enslaved people who knew how to farm it. The French were new to rice. Dumont describes it as a form of wheat. And the skills and knowledge of enslaved Africans who knew rice culture from their own deltaic region was central to the survival and growth of the colony, which thus went on to bring more and more of these people into the vicious and deadly Atlantic machine to develop a plantation culture based around indigo and sugar. So this is Dumont's map of a plantation on the river, and he details for us the ditches, the levees, the cleared land here, which will also be part of the crucial history of the floodplains, the dwellings of the enslaved people, and he even lists the bell that calls them to work. So, like Veronica, I don't very often serve as a cheerleader for growth, but I was asked if I could talk about growth in relation to deltas. The truth is that in this story, growth happens because of this form of enslavement. I can talk about that, and I have done elsewhere, but today I want to turn away from that story in which growth entails violence and turn the term upside down by thinking about it in strictly riverine terms. So in James Scott's recent book, In Praise of Floods, and in other recent readings of floodplains, the floodwaters that so alarmed 18th century settlers can also be understood as a form of growth, the crue, a term that today mostly means flood in French, but in this period more broadly means augmentation, a raising of taxes or a raising of the waters. It's the past participle, I am going to get some French in there, of the verb croître, to grow. And the décrue, the degrowth, is thus the going down of the waters or the going down of prices. So water and economy, always thought about in relation to each other. So the floodplain is strangely a place of both growth and recession, and that recession is paradoxically good for us. The terms set our usual vocabulary adrift. We don't usually think about floods as a form of growth, though I think many hydrologists might say we should. Some forms of agriculture, like the rice-growing cultures of 18th century deltaic West Africa, are known as flood recession agriculture, cultivation décrue, in which the receding waters of the flood do the work for you. This is actually a form of agriculture I know best from Oxford allotment holders, who are riverains in our own floodplain and who sometimes swear by the good harvest they get after the waters go down, though I think it's a brave person who'll eat that produce after Thames water has been at it. So we began with Minet and La Salle, who couldn't see the river for the delta. Southern Louisiana today is living with the consequences of 250 years of seeing only a river and not the delta, not the waterscape in which it sits. This is a vestige from Katrina in 2005. There is no future, no what Veronica called, I love this, convivial lifeway. No convivial lifeway is possible, I think, in southern Louisiana without hearing what the delta's history can tell us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. And with that little French lesson around crue and décrue, I think you brought us to the question of growth, which is, of course, one of the questions we're trying to think about here. Picking up again on what you talked about, how growth becomes kind of normalized and even indeed naturalized in various different ways. And we might think about the whole language of growth in relation to nature as not something outside of human activity, but rather alongside natural processes. Finally, amongst our list of speakers, we move to Dilip.
Well, thank you very much for this invitation. And I mean, thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Wes and Ruth. I guess is here somewhere. Thank you all very much. I mean, this topic is really, I mean, I guess it consumes me. So I'm going to talk about deltas by design. I mean, I'm a designer and tend to see deltas more through possibility than through the problems that they create. So I'll speak about deltas in general, but the same delta that Jim spoke about, the delta in East India, east of the peninsula of the peninsula of India, which you know as the Bengal Delta. The geographers call it the Bengal Delta, but locals call it the Sundarbans, which tends to be a much more complex situation than the simplified delta. So how do you explain this trajectory of maps of this place from 1540s to the 2020s? Is it an improvement of surveying the mouth of three rivers, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and the Meghna? Or is it an ongoing design project to separate water from land with two lines, one on either side of a flow running from a point source in the mountains, gathering tributaries, each contained by two lines, to eventually fan out into several distributaries to empty into the Bay of Bengal each distributary with 2 lines that here not only channel a flow, but also delineate a multiplicity of islands. Now, some of these islands are permanent with settlement and fields. Others are in the process of being built by mangroves that gather sediment, and yet others are starting out in sandbars and debris with no promise that they are there to stay. And they call chores. Boundaries between land and water, writes Amitabh Ghosh in The Hungry Tide, are always mutating, always unpredictable. Anu Jalai, in Forest of the Tigers, a book on the conflict between the cosmopolitan interest in the Bengal tiger and the local world of fishers, honey collectors, and prawn catchers, describes a place where rivers, along with their allies, the tides and storms, continually redesign island topographies, destroying some parts, adding to others, sometimes reclaiming them completely, only to reassemble them a few kilometers away. There is clearly a growing willingness to accept and even celebrate the ambiguity of flows in the Sundarbans, the shifting nature of boundaries, and the changing shapes of islands. Indeed, it has become something of a pastime to make or watch time sequences, sequences of shifting streams, model depositions, and to model depositions and erosion of stream beds. I mean, Fisk, I think Harold Fisk is a good example, who started this in the 1940s with the Mississippi. But underlying this interest in the shifting landscape of a delta, there continues to be an unshakable belief in islands and channels and the line that separates them. A line that in the act of separation creates land that is not water on one side and water that is not land on the other side. Now, there may be ambiguity in the location of this line, but there is nothing ambiguous about the line itself and the binary that it creates, a binary on which the idea of civilization and the language of place are built. Now, this is no ordinary line. It is unlike any of the many lines that we are familiar with in sketches, symbols, and diagrams, or the line we read into things like threads, wires, roads, and streams, or the line we imagine when we connect things like trees in a hedgerow, people in a queue, mountains in a chain, events in time, and steps in an argument. For starters, this line is a line that Euclid defined as only length and no breadth. As such, it cannot be experienced. I mean, how do you experience something that has no presence? No, the geometric line is a pure idea. It must be learned in a classroom or just believed to exist. It matters that this line has no breadth because once plotted by a surveyor on the ground, the change of scale that it undergoes in the transfer from ground to map does not impact the forms that it calls out, the islands and the channels. I mean, this is pure genius, actually, this invention of this line. It goes further. This line does not just facilitate the transfer from the Earth's surface to map. It is empowered to separate land from water, but also to contain water to a channel and give its flow a measure. So when Heraclitus famously declared that you do not step into the same river twice because water is ever flowing, he had already drawn this line that he invites his readers to cross, a line that is both a threshold and a reference against which to see water flow. For all its power, this line cannot be drawn at any time. It requires the rain to stop, the fog to lift, the storm to pass, and the seas to not surge before a surveyor ventures out to draw it. For this, the hydrologic cycle was invented. The infinite river that teaches us that water moves through multiple places and states, always with the possibility of returning to the same place and state. As Robert Horton drew it in 1931, the cycle can be complex, with multiple places and states, multiple moments of water. But it can also be simplified to four moments that Horton shows on the periphery, which is how we all learn it in the 5th grade. Somehow it's always the 5th grade. Precipitation, flow formation, evaporation, and cloud formation. The moment of flow formation is chosen to be the time of the line, a moment when it is not precipitating, not evaporating, and not cloud forming. In short, when it is calm and clear. With this moment chosen to be the time of habitation, rivers automatically become residents of the Earth's surface. While rain, snow, fog, cloud, dew, and all waters of other moments of the cycle become visitors that come and go in weather events like monsoons, typhoons, morning fog, storms, etc. Events that can be bound with a time for their arrival and a time for their departure, patterned with observation and as such made predictable. The line then becomes, the line besides being an invisible separator and reference is also a fair weather line, the basis of fair weather maps that represent a fair weather Earth surface, a surface that may appear a singular space, but is in fact multiple fair weather moments of time. In this time, events like the monsoon, storms, and fog play spoiler. They dull a potentially sunny day, are the cause of inconveniences, and are blamed for disasters that are strangely labeled natural. Now, how do you draw this remarkably gifted line in the mud and mush of the Bengal Delta, where rain and tide combine in the rise and fall of water by 15 feet and more? I mean, this is shot in the same place, actually, when we visited the Sundarbans in 2015, I think it was, where mangroves, in their very being, defy the separation of land and water by defying the division of plant into roots and shoots. Wherein the estimate of the 19th century geologist Charles Lyell, the Ganges alone deposits the equivalent of 360 great pyramids of Cheops, I assume, of soil a year, 340 in the 3 months of the monsoon alone. That is enough to raise a square of 30-odd miles by a foot. Add to this the stuff brought down by the Brahmaputra and Meghna and a century and a half of deforestation across the Himalayas, and one can only wonder at the dynamic stuff of this place that I think Jim has already spoken about. Yet the line is drawn and then built up with mud embankments. Government gazetteers of the 1800s speak of the incredibly laborious task of uprooting mangroves, building embankments, desalinating soil, and maintaining it, all in the face of regular destruction. When Catherine spoke about the crawfish in the Mississippi, which we heard about also when we traveled there, and here, when we traveled, we heard about the crab that comes through. You know, in fact, you put your ear to the mud embankment and you can hear them coming through. Yeah? social scientists study the people who live behind these embankments as locals, even referring to them as indigenous, documenting their customs, language, and intersection with wildlife in the belief that they are centuries old. But are these people of this place? Would people of this place live behind embankments, given that this is the gateway to the southwest monsoon that deposits an average of 70 inches of rain, besides being in the path of typhoons? Or are these people just choiceless and oppressed, people displaced from elsewhere, at some time trying to make a home as best they can, assisted today by serious believers in the line who are turning mud embankments into concrete, turning what they see as islands into deadly bowls of land below sea level, I guess what Jim called polarization. So no indigenous people, a person, we believe, will inhabit a place in the monsoon and the path of typhoons behind embankments. Indeed, they would not position themselves on land in a battle with water. Herodotus observed the Egyptians living on mounds. Which was the third option, I think, that Jim mentioned at the end of his talk. Mounds that they built and raised in the Nile, describing a mode of habitation that between the summer solstice and autumn equinox resembled islands in the Aegean Sea. This was Herodotus writing in the histories. Alexander's men saw Indians doing the same in the Indus. Mounds was likely the mode of inhabiting the mouth of the Rhine before it became a matter of national pride to say that you live below sea level, behind heroic dikes. I think they call them terps or terpins. Interventions like the dike and levee are misguided short-term interventions that start at a few inches and before long grow into tens of feet, becoming too costly to undo. And so that's what you see over here. This is the polarization, I guess, and those are the mounds on which most of the ancients lived, and people even today actually inhabit high grounds in a field of wetness rather than these bowls, deadly bowls on a river. Mounds are likely how Native Americans inhabited the Mississippi. These people, like those in the Nile, the Indus, and Rhine, did not inhabit the banks of rivers that flowed and flooded. They very likely never deployed a line. They rather inhabited an ocean of wetness that reached from clouds to deep aquifers without the concept of a surface, that is, without the concept of land or a line. Working habitation by gradients of wet and less wet rather than separations of land and water, dry and wet. Indeed, when Herodotus asked the Egyptians for the cause of the Nile floods, he says they did not know. It did not occur to him that they did not see flood because they did not draw a line to create a channeled entity called a river to begin with. They merely lived with the rise and fall of wetness. These people remind us of a simple truth that we fail to acknowledge. We live in an all-consuming ocean of wetness, a wetness that is everywhere in the air, earth, sea, flora, and fauna, precipitating, evaporating, storming, seeping, soaking, osmoting. The sea is very wet, and the desert only less wet. We participate in this ocean as wet stuff ourselves. Our wetness necessary to our existence, necessary to the eye that sees, body that feels, and common sense that knows. The ancients were in awe of this ocean. Its ubiquity, vitality, necessity, and power to transform and be transformed fascinated and terrified them. They called it ocean. And ocean is our planet. It is a planet that astronauts never leave when they profess to see their home from thousands of miles away. Ocean, after all, is in their eyes. Eyes that, if they're not wet, would be dead. Unfortunately, we are not taught that we live in ocean. Instead, we learn that we live on a planet called Earth, with a surface that is 70% water and 30% land. Except, of course, it is 100% land with water in its service, tasked with supplying and draining land, shaping and improving it, providing it with energy, transport, and today, waterfronts. It is for the sake of land that we push water back, displace it, even erase it at will. Are we then not just witnessing the drawing of a geometric line in the Sundarbans, to create a river delta, but the laying out of a geometric surface in an ocean of wetness to create a land-centered earth that enslaves water, a water that today, more than ever before, threatens us and our self-image as land dwellers from across a line with sea level rise, glacier melts, and increasingly violent and unpredictable storm events, particularly in places like the Sundarbans. Now, I would love to share with you, how this design project is conceived and implemented in an ocean, and the consequences it has for the way we experience the past, present, and future. But I will leave that for another time. For now, I will simply say that if there is one reason for us to care about places like the Sundarbans, it is not for its mangroves and the protection they afford land dwellers, not for the carbon they sequester, not for the wildlife and people that we want to believe are indigenous to place that we insist on defining for them as the delta of a river. It is rather because these places remind us more than any other that the river is an unsustainable human creation, conceived in arrogance to control the place of water on an earth surface, itself a human creation, to order a ubiquitous wetness. We need to return to the drawing board with an immersive imagination, working with gradients in ocean rather than separations on an earth surface, and devise a language of place that is less combative, less violent. We can then design a transition and not continue to live in fear of an enemy that we have created in water across a line.
Well, there's a challenge to end our four speakers. We're going to take a minute or two to put some chairs up on this dais, and then we'll move to questions. If you want to move around, and there's a water closet outside, if you need that. We'll start up again in, let's say, 5 minutes, just for 10, 15 minutes of questions before we move to drinks. So, yeah, take your time, come back again in 5 minutes. We'll start at 1:45, and we'll start with some questions. Thank you. I think we can agree that we've had an extraordinary journey, an extraordinary set of questions raised by each of our speakers, with also it's almost like we planned it. There were moments where the papers spoke to each other, where our speakers picked up on points that others had started with, and I wanted to start the questions. If anybody had a question for any particular speaker, and then we'll move on to some general ones after that. Yes, sir. 1 second. Just to set the protocol, I'll come with you with the mic if you're this side. Otherwise, it'll Andrea who'll come with you with the mic back there.
Hi, question for Jim. About your predictions for 200 to 300 years hence for sea rises. You talked about a fairly large rise and a fairly modest one. What's the degree of error on those? And then secondly, what's your worst prediction yourself?
So in terms of the degree of error, you saw those, the bars on the graphs there. 2100, the range, I mean, the bottom end of the range is pretty clear because we're looking at what's happened in the past and what's going on now. 0.6, 0.7 meters. The top end of the range is much more uncertain because of the uncertainty in the ice sheet dynamics. So we're seeing things going on with ice sheets which have not happened before, and we don't know what the implications of that will be. And then as things go further into the future, obviously the error bars become bigger and it becomes more dependent on what we do now and in the coming years in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. What happens between now and actually most of the way to 2100 is already locked in based on the global warming that has taken place already.
Thank you. Any other questions to any specific speakers? If not, yes, okay. Please go to me.
Thank you very much for this very provocative and thought-provoking presentation by all of you. I would like to ask something, Veronica. If we see the representation aspect of your comments for the continental shelves of oceans, seas, they are very well represented. And they are legal entities, they are property rights, and so on and so forth, and disputes, of course. And we have this underrepresentation, legal underrepresentation for deltas and rivers. How do you assess this difference with respect to the legal entity of these two rather similar concepts?
Did you hear that?
Not
Wasn't
quite
altogether
all of it, no, if you
heard.
wouldn't mind.
It's about legal representation, and I think the proposition is that some bodies of water, shall we say, are already better represented than others. And how do you find a more equitable form of representation, let's say for deltas and rivers, than for oceans and other forms of water that we've organised into legal bodies?
Thank you. That's a lovely question. And I think I would probably reverse it and start from the other end and say, well, actually, they all need some kind of democratic representation. And we should actually build that into our relationships with non-human entities generally. But you're quite right, like humans, some are much better represented than others. So the Mar Menor in Spain, I'm just working on a project in the Venetian Lagoon, you know, they get favoured, and particular mountains and rivers get favoured according to their context and their visibility. But it's actually the same with animal species, that some species are better represented than others. But if we start from a premise that they should all have some kind of democratic representation. And in the question of legal personhood is sometimes a little bit of a red herring, I think, because it gets tangled up in notions of what constitutes an animated being, what constitutes a sentient being, what constitutes agency, and it gets tangled up in religion. And when in New Zealand, when we did the whole stuff with the Whanganui River, there was a lot of objection to bringing religion into law. But you can also start with the other side of that, which is a fundamental ethical question about whether we actually have the right to destroy other species and ecosystems. So it's not necessarily personhood that's the key thing so much as a question about representing needs and interests. But personhood is useful because it kind of crystallizes the problem. So in that sense, I think it helps. But let's start from the other end and build from the ground up a notion that actually everything that contributes to our co-created world really should be considered in that kind of way. Does that? It's a bit radical, I know, but, you know, actually we need to be a bit radical because what we're doing is not working.
Thank you. Has anyone got a question that's a broader question rather than one aimed at an individual? Yes. So there's one here and one at the back. I'll start here.
Thank you very much for the fascinating talks. I was wondering, because in all of your research projects, it seems that you are encouraging us to think of new ways how we imagine humanity and non-humans and other terms that we use to describe humanity. How do you incorporate local epistemologies of local people who, one can argue have for many centuries have developed their own way of thinking of non-human in a way that sometimes in Western posthumanism perhaps we could appropriate. So how do you navigate this very tricky positionality in a way as I am myself doing in a way, which is why I'm wondering what would you advise to scholars? How do we navigate this sort of not to impose a particular worldview, if you see what I mean? Yes, thank you very much.
I don't want to make you self-conscious, but it is interesting that you use the word navigate when thinking about a conceptual and ethical set of questions. It goes back to what Dilip was talking about the language we use around rivers and lines and navigation and so on. But Catherine, you were nodding in answer to that. Do you have things to say in response?
I understood you to be thinking about how we take on, for example, an indigenous worldview that Veronica is thinking about in contemporary worlds and that I'm looking at in historical worlds. So of two rivers I work on, the St. Lawrence and the Mississippi, that indigenous history and its relation to the present works a little differently. So in the Mississippi region in southern Louisiana, the texts I'm working on are looking at an indigenous world that's no longer there because of migrations, internal migrations probably sparked by the arrival of the Spanish in the region in the 16th century. But so a sort of ghostly relation to that presence. In the St. Lawrence, the peoples that the French are describing in the 17th century are still present in that region. And that 17th century record takes on a strained significance, I would say. It's both the record of the beginning of a colonial violence, and it's a historical record that is significant to the present community, including linguistically in the kind of thinking about language history. And so there's a kind of way in which you have to, people talk about reading against the grain, but liquidly I'm thinking of it against the flow, to take on particular ways of reading between the past and present communities' interpretation of that past. But it also might mean looking at different sorts of sources. I'm thinking of the work of the great historian of science, Chandra Mukherjee, who writes about the creation of the Canal du Midi in France, and she's looking at labor records of who's paid to work on that canal, and to think about the very kind of local knowledge. So the kind of key players in her book are the washerwomen, who reteach the Paris engineers the construction techniques that you use for building well in water. So I think it involves, for me, drawing on lots of different kinds of sources and trying to think about how those sources are read and if they signify something for communities today. But you have a very different take, I think.
Very different, but slightly different angle, because as an anthropologist, of course, I would never talk about an indigenous worldview. I would talk about multiplicity in indigenous worldviews. And that's kind of what I meant about preservation of cultural diversity, is you get a whole host of perspectives. And one of the problems with the more international debate about, legal personhood, etc., is it tends to try to squash very complex indigenous worldviews into much narrower sort of legal mechanisms. And what indigenous leaders whom I work with generally say is, our relationship is so much more than that. But then you have capacities like UNESCO, for example, which attempts to bring multiple worldviews into conversation with each other. And then, of course, you come back to the key point about equality, that if actually we have a greater degree of equality between human groups, then you have a greater array of cultural diversity to learn from. having said that, I think there are particular kinds of indigenous worldviews that share some common kinds of characteristics about relationality and equality with the non-human, and those are the ones that have tended to inspire conversations about different paradigms of engaging. So there is a common thread, and of course indigenous groups all talk to each other internationally now, and so there's a sort of coalescence of message about, well, can we come from a different position at this, and so forth. So there's a lot going on, but you really have to think about plurality and complexity in each of those.
Thank you. This was a question pitched to everybody, so I want to give Jim and or Dilip a chance to respond to it if you want to, or should we move on to the next question?
Yeah. I mean, I could, one of the things that, as a designer, I pay a lot of attention to the visual and the visual imaging that, through which scholars have looked at various peoples across the world. And I find, for example, the map to be taken for granted in order to actually position people, by place. So the language of place is very much driven by the language of the map. And when I see that, I ask this question. I said, is it possible? If you understand the map is something that has to be seen from above. It is a documentation of the Earth's surface when looked at with an eye that is at infinity. So it's drawing with parallel lines, actually, and representing ground with parallel lines. Now, how many people would think of this? Would think of imaging their place like this? And yet, the map is the post-colonialist, for example, go-to image in order to explain conditions of a particular place or to explain, the colonized and the colonizer, to bring them onto a common ground of conflict that you want to study. So I look at some of these, or even, for example, now, the assumption that different people, that the difference lies in the way people see things. So they see things differently. I look at it differently. What I say is that people see different things. They don't see the same things differently, necessarily. Now, how do you accommodate something like that? That they're not looking at the same species. They're not looking at the same object. So, for example, a tree. When I talk about a tree, then you realize actually that what goes into what we consider to be a tree, I've got to shake off the nests, I've got to take away the birds, I've got to uproot, take out the soil, I've got to clean out this thing in order to have this woody thing that I then define as a tree. Who would engage that act of violence in order to create an object that is separate? And then I can say that the bird nests in the tree, or that the trees speak to each other. I've already individuated it in a way that is possibly outside the reach of most peoples in the world. So we still speak this language where words are associated with objects. So I don't pay much attention to the differences, that are, that could exist and probably exist. I speculate on the possibility of seeing different things, And so that is why I can question, something like what we take for granted to be a river that drains land, or to consider land to be the common ground. So I don't see Columbus, for example, discovering a new, he saw himself discovering a new land. And the way in which we talk about indigenous people, being given back their land and in possession of their land, to me is to assume that land was a language, is in their language that they spoke, which assumes that there is an earth surface. But if they lived between clouds and aquifers without the nature of a surface, I can think of a completely different mode of habitation as a designer. So it's possible for me to expand the way in which I look at different peoples because I don't take image seriously. In this sense, I'm still open to reading.
Thank you. We have been, encouraged here to really expand our minds, to think again about water, land, about the ways in which we live on the earth, with the earth, and through water. And I just want to ask you to thank one more time our four speakers for really immersing us in a whole range of different ways of thinking about why deltas matter. Thank you all.